Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on relational investments, or what I term the ARROWS concept. We're going to be talking today about what it means to conserve and to invest our energy in interpersonal relationships in our lives, and hopefully have you think a little bit more about who and how you invest your energy with and in. The thing I want to start off saying is that relationships 100% of the time take work. They are inconvenient and they need to continually be reassessed. What do I mean when I say this? First off, we know that relationships take work, meaning we have to be willing to invest time, money, and or energy in our relationships in order to have a return. They are not just something that happen to us and don't require us to show up or to give of ourselves. That kind of leads me into that second point of relationships being inconvenient. It's not convenient to show up for and to be a part of other relationships, at least not all the time. For example, being in a relationship with my husband, I have been friends with him, in a partnership with him. We are parents for 10 years at this point. And as much as I would not trade that relationship for anything else, sometimes showing up for that relationship is not convenient. It'd be a lot easier for me if I could make my schedule around what I wanted to do. If I could do the things that I wanted, or maybe pick the shows that I wanted to watch, or to not have to compromise or to prioritize somebody else. There was a time about a year ago where he was biking to work and somehow blew a tire. And it was a terrible day for him. He had to get to a shift in the emergency department. I think he ended up having to walk with his bike for about a mile in the rain, which Portland rain can suck pretty bad. And so walking all the way there was not a great start to his day. He worked a full shift and then asked me to come pick him up at the end of my workday, which for me meant I was driving all the way across town during rush hour traffic to come pick him up. And I think probably at that point, it was like a 45-minute drive to come get him. I had planned on going to work out. I was going to run a few errands. My day was going to look a lot different. Obviously, his was planned to be a lot different too. But in that moment, it's hard not to feel inconvenienced. I had to completely change my schedule to show up for him. And yes, I wanted to. I'm not complaining about it. I think I did that day 100%. But it's really something where if we were to label it as convenient, that would be a lie. Again, I would choose to do that. I'm happy I was able to be there for him, and it wasn't a convenience thing. And then the third part is that I have to assess how I'm spending my time and my energy in all of my relationships regularly. And this is really important for us, and in particular in this day and age, because we are no longer in a position where we need to deal with endings in the same way as our ancestors. So even think 2-3 generations ago, if you didn't have Facebook, if you didn't have somebody's cell phone number or some form of social media, if you didn't get somebody's address or home phone number when you moved away or when you left college or changed jobs, you didn't have a relationship anymore. You had to make sure that you had their primary contact information and you had to keep it going. Now we can just be Facebook friends with somebody that we haven't talked to in 10 or 15 years, and we never have to actually terminate or end a relationship. In some ways that's nice, and in many ways it makes it so that we aren't as stringent in thinking about who and how we want to maintain connections with. So we get inundated with connection, and oftentimes those connections are not serving us. So what I really want us to be thinking about is how to understand that, again, I am not saying that every relationship needs to be convenient all the time, because it won't be. Relationships are a choice of inconvenience because the greater outcome is better than the inconvenience. I'm saying that you are going to have to be willing to put work into your relationships, and it's really important that we do take a look at and assess how those relationships are serving us, because ultimately that work should be doing work for us as well. It's the same as if I maintain and I'm an investment portfolio. I don't want to just keep investing without thinking about how those investments are paying off for me. So what I want you to think about is, and this is where the ARROWS concept comes into play, is this idea of how in the direction we give our energy fuels a relationship. So I just want to point out, when you're trying to find clip art that shows body types that are inclusive and that would be representative of people of all different identities, it is incredibly difficult. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to use these two clip art images from Keynote that I was able to find that at least are not specific to a certain race. And they definitely show certain elements of identity that do not necessarily form an inclusive picture. That being said, I want you to imagine you and any other relationship and fill in the blank in the bubble of what those relationships look like for you. Again, for the purposes of today, we're going to go with these two images throughout the video. So coming back to this discussion on relationships, looking here at these two overall arrow investments, what you want to think about is that every relationship has a general balance of about a 50-50 investment. That doesn't mean that every day at all points of interaction that you are giving 50% and they are giving 50% and kind of canceling out to that net neutral zero. What we're saying is the average is about a 50-50. The one caveat here that most people, especially if you are a parent or a caregiver, that you will say is that this is not true of often caregiver-child relationships. Oftentimes, you're going to be giving a lot more if you are in that caregiver role, at least in the early form of the relationship. Or if we're talking about the return on our investment, it just looks very different than what we're talking about here. So we're talking about adult relationships in this moment. Two adults, two interactions where the overall energy and investment can look at least somewhat similar. So when you think about your relationships, again, it's not that you're always giving 50% and they are. There are going to be times in your relationship where you're going to be giving 90% because that person in your life is going through a ton of stuff and they need you to show up and to give them a lot more than they can give you. And then there are going to be times where you're going to need those relationships to give you 90% or 70% or whatever that is because your energy levels are lower. But overall, if we can see a net balance of around zero, what that means is we're both able to give and show up in those relationships relatively equal in the general or sort of neutral space overall. So again, sometimes that means that you're going to be giving 90, they're going to be giving 10 and vice versa. But oftentimes what I'm seeing and where there tends to be a problem is when people are feeling resentful, feeling frustrated, or feeling like they are not fulfilled in their relationships. And when we do an assessment, their general is not this 50-50. Their general is not an average of net neutrality. Their average tends to be one or the other here. And most often it tends to be the person that's falling in the I'm giving 90% in every one of my relationships and I'm feeling resentful, burned out, tired, and I don't feel like I'm getting what I need. So for the purposes of the rest of this video, if you are not in alignment with that place, it's still a helpful video to watch and it might not be the growth that you're looking for right now. So what I want you to think about is again, most of us watching this are going to fall in this line. If you are somebody that if you do a survey and an assessment of your relationships and you're falling in that camp of I give a lot more than I get, then this is really where we need to be exploring. And now, to be clear, this is not to shit on the people that you have a relationship with, because what ends up happening is while these relationships do leave us feeling resentful, exhausted, ashamed, irritated, lonely, there's reasons why we do it. For many of us, it is our shame talking. It's our shame telling us that we have to give so much in order to be worthy of that relationship. We have to invest more than anybody else that we're in a relationship with in order for them to want to stay. I have to be the best friend, the best partner, the best employee, whatever that dynamic is, and I have to give always more than I get. A classic example, at least in my life, is that I will realize now, looking back on it, how many people would have tried to invest in having a relationship with me and maybe giving more than that 10%, and I would shut it down. It wasn't them, it was me. They'd say, how are you doing? What's going on in your life? And within 10 seconds, I had the conversation back on them because my shame was telling me that's the only way that I would be worthy and valuable. I was uncomfortable with people showing up for me. This happened even recently. I have a really awesome friend who has pushed me a lot on this in my own relationship, and she showed up. She bought me, we were having lunch. We were talking about I was pregnant. I had all these awesome things going on, and she bought me lunch. And I immediately felt like I had to calculate in my head when was the next time and the next opportunity that I could buy her lunch. Could I do something else? Could I show up in a different way? I was so uncomfortable with her wanting to just do something nice for me in the relationship and to celebrate me being pregnant and all the new things that were happening. And so I felt this almost angst. I'm feeling it now, even talking, of thinking, if I can't do something to reciprocate and to overextend, why would she want to stay in the relationship? Because she's going to feel like it's not good for her. Is that true? No. And we'll talk about really why we're changing this and what happens to actually be able to accept those things. But for you, I'm assuming it's the same thing. Your shame has told you that you need to be everything for everybody else. And so you and every other end point, so kind of thinking back to the other person on the other end of that relationship, you've co-created a dynamic in which what has been acceptable and normalized between the two of you is that you give more than you expect from them. So again, this isn't to shit on those people. It's not to dump on them and to say that they're crappy in relationships or to say, well, look, you did all this. This is your fault. This is to say there's shared ownership. Your shame has played a role in the way that you've created these relationships. And on the other side of it, at some point, if somebody's trying to invest in a relationship more and they're getting pushback, why would they keep trying to give more? And if I'm socialized to give only 10% in my relationship with somebody, I'm not going to start to voluntarily give more if that's what has been seen as being enough. So my example is oftentimes if we think about another investment, if I am told that I only have to pay $30,000 for my college tuition, I'm not going to counter the offer and say, you know what, I'm going to give you $100,000. That feels better for me. I'm going to say, okay, great deal, right? Or whatever that might be. If somebody's telling me I can buy something for $1, why would I tell them I'm going to give them $100? So making space for this, and there's a lot of opportunity to reflect in different videos and trainings that I have, including a webinar that I do on considering your relationships and really kind of going deeper in what they mean for you. I want you to make space to understand this is really something that's been created, and likely it's been your way of needing to show up and how others have then just been kind of constructed to be in relationships with you. And some people, yeah, they're just going to be shitty. You're going to have brought people in that only give 10% and only want to volunteer 10%. So what we want to think about is, okay, if this is our norm, we're exhausted, we're feeling lonely, we want to figure out how to shift this. Let's talk about, okay, then how do we change this? And the caveat here then is to think, what is within your power and your circle of control to shift the narrative of your relationship so that you're no longer feeling like you're giving so much and that that's the only way that you can be valuable. That being said, so much of this is going to come from then your decision to pull back and to stop giving so much in all of your relationships. I'm not saying to not invest in your relationships. I'm saying stop giving so much that you're feeling so drained. Pull back and find that balance point of that overall 50%. Now, what's going to happen is, and you'll see this here, where if that other person is giving 10% and you suddenly pull back from 90 to 50, you're going to have this, what I call a circle of distress that's built. There's going to be this gap here that is suddenly going to be formed that is going to cause some tension. You're going to feel like you're not reaching out, they're not reaching out. What's going on? Is the relationship over? What's happening? You're going to feel like you should be doing more. All of your negative self-talk is going to show up. The other person on the other end might feel frustrated or confused as to why you're suddenly not putting in as much work anymore. All of that tension is distress that we need to let sit there. Because the overall goal that we're going for is relationships that have more balance. So if you go in and you feel that distress or you try to navigate their distress, all you're going to do is eventually lead yourself back to feeling resentful, exhausted, and ashamed because you're going to be giving 90 and they're going to be giving 10. So instead, what we want to consider is, how do you allow that gap to exist and for that other end of the party to slowly show up and fill the gap? Now, I want to be clear, not every person in every relationship is going to do this. And the relationships that are worth keeping in your lives, this will happen. Sometimes it means you're going to have a conversation with them very directly. You're going to say, hey, I'm working on not investing so much because my shame story tells me that the only way you want to be my friend is if I am the one that is always doing everything for you. And I know that that's a me thing to get over, so I'm going to work on not doing that. Maybe a very specific example is telling them, when you ask me how I'm doing and I try to turn the conversation back to you, pull it back and make me answer the question. make me be a part of that a little bit more, right? Or maybe saying to them, I want you to, when I immediately follow up something nice that you do for me with wanting to put it back on something I do for you, I want you to call me out on that and remind me that it's okay that you can be there for me. And it's all right if right now I'm not showing up for you in that same way, because that's what it means for us to ebb and flow in our relationship. So what you're going to see here, I want you to imagine this overall gradation and shift. The only way that this growth is going to happen is if you allow the tension to exist long enough that they fill in that gap. So if I, again, make it too comfortable and easy for them to go back to 10%, why would they give 30? Or why would they move towards 50? But if overall I let that tension exist, I keep showing up, but maybe asserting my boundary, eventually they're going to be able to come and meet me at that point, and we can shift our overall dynamic and exchange to roughly, again, that 50-50 neutral space. Now, there's another key piece here. If somebody is existing at that 10, you make this space and you set your boundaries and you move back to your rough, 50% average, and they keep giving 10%, that's a sign that maybe that's a relationship that's no longer serving you. So when we talked about needing to assess our relationships, this is a really key opportunity to do that, to realize that you don't have to then go back to giving 90 to salvage a relationship if they're not willing to budge. Maybe the question is then, is the relationship still serving you, and is it worth it? Is it worth continuing to invest in something that they're only going to be willing to ever give you 10%? And if you only give 50, you either have to deal with this tension in between, or you have to exist with a lot of that gap in between your relationship, which to me doesn't feel like it's really serving me in either direction. When this happens, it means that we have to really work on letting go of the feeling like everything is about us needing to prove our worth and value to somebody else. We have to really be able to shift our thinking and our narrative to make space for ourselves and for everyone else in our lives, and to say that they have the right not to show up in these relationships, maybe in the way that I might want them to. And I have the right to make choices about relationships I have in my life being in service of me and them. Right? We're not saying it's now moving to being all about us. I don't want to only give 10%. That doesn't feel good for me either. But what I'm saying is, if my average existence in relationships is not about both of us, then it's not really a relationship. It's either something that becomes transactional, or it becomes a place where one of us is just in service to the other person at all times. And a key point in all of this, and this is something I think so many of us can be working on, is we need to learn how to tolerate our own distress. This is really where that growth in our shame happens. And I'm going to put a link down in the notes for you to not only be able to access that relationship webinar if you're interested in going deeper, but if you want to explore and look at some of the resources I have on shame, this is something that's really key, because I have to learn how to work through my shame and to let go of the belief that I have to prove that I'm worthy. And I have to be able to tolerate somebody else's distress as well as my own in order to make sure that I am making choices that are ultimately best for me and can be in service of that other person. Because at the end of this, we have the right to choose what's best for us in our lives. We have the right to choose relationships that serve us. And yeah, not every relationship is going to serve us at every point of that interaction. Sometimes we are going to have a lot of inconveniences. Sometimes we are going to have to give 90% to those relationships because they really need us to show up and do that. And if we can't trust that those same relationships are going to show up and do the same thing for us when we really need it, it's no longer an investment worth making. If you are ready to go deeper in this, if you have some aha moments, questions, ways I can support you, please comment below. Let me know how I can help you. And again, for all of you that are interested, there are some resources in the info notes down below for you to go deeper on the topics. And definitely check out the membership portal if you aren't already a member. There are tons more resources for you to be able to go deeper on this topic overall.